You're listening to Heritage Radio Network.
Here we are at Last Call. It's Erica, and today's conversation is brought to you by Force Brands. I'm joined by Rachel Dueck, a Senior Director of Client Strategy at Force Brands. Thanks so much for joining us, Rachel.
Thanks for having me, Erica. It's so good to be here on one of my favorite podcasts. So
I love to hear that. All right, well, let's hop in. I am interested to hear about Force Brands. Tell me how it works with drinks companies.
Force Brands started about 20 years ago from a former founder of a spirits company. And so he launched Force Brands. We were BevForce at the time, really because there was no other talent acquisition partner out there that worked with the drinks business. So, we've extended into different, areas within consumer categories, but our founding category is drinks. And now that's definitely evolved into the total adult beverage, categories from cannabis beverage to spirits, wine, beer, beyond beer, all the categories underneath the adult drinks business. But we are a people strategy and talent acquisition partner to brands that, are going through different growth phases. And we work with companies really of all shapes and sizes, but, primarily that mid-market, high growth stage brand, all the way up to, some of the strategic, spirits and wine companies and really take pride in a lot of the work that we've done with brands that kind of go through high growth all the way to sale.
Yeah, wow. I mean, with such a range of clients and company sizes, you must see a lot of the trends that are happening in this space. So, we're in this interesting time in the drinks business where some categories are contracting, but others are rapidly growing. So what are the trends you see in the HR and talent acquisition space right now?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I was actually thinking back to when I first started in 2010. And so that was right after the market crashed. And so when I started, things were slowly coming back to, it was still an interesting place. I mean, there was a lot of people, great talent on the market. But then, you had some of those really, really cool brands popping into the beverage alcohol space, and think back when Saint Germain launched and a number of brands like that. So, now just thinking back to that and what we're seeing now is relatively, and I know that there's a lot of, bad press about the industry and all that, and people not hiring and, layoffs happening. And yeah, a lot of that is definitely happening, but there still is growth. I think, we actually ran the numbers pretty recently just to see, where the growth was coming from. And we're seeing growth within the brands that are, call it the, 20 to 50, 20 to 100, $1 million in revenue right now. And I think that stage is where you're getting, VCs and private equity kind of coming to you and knocking on your door, seeing if you're ripe for them to invest in the business. So, with that, sales and marketing, it's always, a larger growth vertical than any other verticals, but we did see a pretty big uptick in finance hires recently. And most of that, like from a sales perspective, I think, a lot of brands that are growing they're cutting back on, your street level salespeople. In all honesty, I mean, I think a lot of brands are working with, fractional sales teams to eliminate a lot of the overhead costs that, that brands used to have when they were hiring 20 people across the US. I don't know that that's necessarily needed with, some of the great, fractional sales teams out there right now. So when you look at sales roles, I would say director and definitely like strategic leadership, talent, as well as, on the marketing side too, similar kind of range from a level perspective. I'm also seeing a lot of companies go through leadership transitions and leadership changes, which does happen. I think there's different leaders at different stages of growth that companies need. And I'll talk to you a little bit more about that later. But yeah, it's interesting. You have some family owned businesses that, are shifting and, adding more leadership talent or just making some changes. So
Yeah.
those are some of the trends that I'm seeing.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like there's just, there's a lot of change happening in the industry right now. And like the sort of, the boots on the street, sometimes that's the focus. Sometimes it's these higher level strategic roles. Like it kind of just sounds like it must depend on the kind of currents of what's happening in the broader industry. So that's really interesting. I wanted to ask, what are some of the most common mistakes that you see founders make when scaling their organizations?
Yeah, it's a great question, and definitely depends on the stage, but I would say companies between the 0 to $15 million in revenue, I see them overhire for what they need now before they have the capital and before they're ready to really, grow and expand the business. So, as an example, you don't necessarily need a CEO to come in when you're at that stage. Maybe hire someone on an interim or like fractional basis to help you raise the capital that you need. And then when you're ready and you can afford it, bring someone in. So that's just specific to that kind of, growth stage type of organization. But I do want to point out, I do see a lot of, founders and executives stay really loyal to, their employees, which is not a bad thing, but you always need to be thinking about, what the outcome of the business needs to be in 3 years from then. And so, preparing for that and thinking through, do I have the right talent in the seat now, today, and for the future? So I think loyalty can be, to a fault at times for, certain founders and executives within the drink space.
Interesting. Yeah, I hadn't considered that necessarily. Well, what are some of the practical tips or advice that you can share with founders who are in hiring mode?
Yeah. Again, I would go back to think about what you want the outcome of the business to be. Like, what is the end goal for you? And don't think in small increments. What does, the first quarter look like? Think to the future so that you can really prepare. And, speaking directly as it relates to like talent acquisition and HR strategy, I do think it's important to really like figure out what those case volume goals, revenue volume goals are, and couple that with how you need to organize the team. And it's not just putting someone, in a seat for, a role. It's figuring out the long-term goal and how you're going to plan for that.
Hmm. Yeah. And I think a lot of companies, at the early stages, it's just hard to plan that far out. So, like, really starting to say, what is our strategic framework? Where do we need to be in 3, in 5, in 10 years? And of course, the plan always changes, but putting those goalposts in and goalposts, not just from a revenue perspective, but from an organizational perspective, I think it sounds to me like that can make a huge amount of difference in helping your company to scale effectively.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And, one other thing to add, I've seen a lot of companies hire without having specific KPIs and measurement goals in place for their leadership hires. And sometimes those aren't established until 6 months down the road, which is not ideal because then there's no alignment, over those 6 months. And there might not be, 6 months to a year from then. And then you're kind of rethinking back to what the strategy is. So definitely I would say advice, set yourself up for success, and the new hire, whether that's a manager or whether that's C-suite leadership, have that plan in place for them as well and yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. I always love like the 90-day onboard plan and like have that initial set of goals. And then from that period, like, okay, here's our KPIs moving forward for like the next 12 months or whatever. Yeah, I think just having that clear alignment from the get go can make such a difference. And, businesses at all stages can struggle with those things. So, super sage advice. Thank you so much for joining us, Rachel. It's always so fun to see you. You're one of my favorite people in the New York drinks world. So, it's always a pleasure.
Thank you so much. It was so great being on one of my favorite podcasts. So thank you for having me. And yeah.
Awesome. Well, thanks everyone for joining us on Business of Drinks. Follow us on Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you're listening and tap that notification button so you'll be the first to know when a new episode drops. And help us spread the word. Click those star ratings and share on social. It really does help us find new listeners. Finally, if there's something that you'd like to hear us talk about on the podcast, let us know. Email us, podcast@businessofdrinks.com, or reach out via Instagram or LinkedIn. We do want to hear from you, and we respond to our messages. See you next time.